Ah, yes, the Titanic. The ship that was called unsinkable until it met one very stubborn iceberg. But what most people don't tell you, the real sinking began before the iceberg, right in its scandal-filled cabins. Think less Romance of the Sea and more floating Vegas, but with corsets and coal smoke. Smash subscribe like a deck chair in third class and tell me, are you watching this during a midnight binge or while pretending to work from home? When people imagine the Titanic, they picture doomed violins, star-crossed lovers, and Leonardo DiCaprio freezing like a tragic ice cube. But behind the glamour, the ship was crawling with scandals that would make even the most jaded Victorian blush. First-class cabins weren't just bedrooms, they were rented theaters of desire. Aristocrats brought their mistresses on board disguised as maids. Newspapers later whispered that one duke had brought both his secretary and his mistress and accidentally booked them in rooms side by side. Imagine the panic of mixing up room keys. That's not Downton Abbey. That's HBO with a maritime budget. And then there were the American millionaires, industrialists whose marriages were about as stable as the ship's rivets. One rumor told of a steel tycoon who tried to christen every hallway steward he met, slipping them cash like a drunken OnlyFans subscriber. He survived the iceberg, but his marriage didn't survive the gossip columns. Meanwhile, in second class, love affairs blossomed between people who technically shouldn't have been talking. Teachers with sailors, widows with students, even a preacher rumored to have taken confession a little too literally. Pamphlets after the disaster called it the most indecent ark since Noah's. Harsh, but effective for newspaper sales. And don't think third class was any less exciting. Below deck, the Irish migrants turned steerage into a kind of proto-nightclub. Fiddles, dances, and a lot of romantic entanglements in bunk rooms where curtains were optional. Picture TikTok's cabin core trend, but with less privacy and more whiskey. Every 40 seconds, something was happening that no Edwardian etiquette manual could explain. Caricatures in satirical magazines depicted Titanic as a floating brothel where the iceberg was less a tragedy, more of a judgment from Neptune. By the way, did you know the famous unsinkable Molly Brown wasn't just known for her survival? Gossip columns claimed she shocked other women by openly joking about husbands sneaking into wrong cabins at night. Imagine your aunt surviving the shipwreck and then roasting everyone's bedroom choices over champagne. Iconic. And then there's the iceberg irony. The wealthy men who'd bribed officers to secure privacy for their companions ended up scrambling for lifeboats right alongside the wives they'd hoped to avoid. Tabloids later wrote, if the Atlantic didn't drown them, scandal surely did. So yes, Titanic was the grandest ship afloat, but it was also a floating tinderbox of lust, lies, and late-night rendezvous. The iceberg merely froze a story that was already scandalously hot. Titanic promised luxury, but what it really delivered was a floating gossip magazine. And trust me, the scandal didn't sink with the ship. Forget the iceberg for a moment. The real cold shock was what happened in Titanic's Turkish baths. Yes, the ship had a luxurious steam bath, tiled like a Roman palace, and rumors said it was the hottest room on board, in more ways than one. Millionaires sneaked in with companions, pretending to sweat out impurities. Spoiler, the impurities weren't exactly leaving. One New York newspaper joked that the Titanic's Turkish bath was less about wellness and more about witness protection. A gentleman entered with his valet and left with another man's wife, the column quipped. If you thought gym locker rooms had drama, imagine one where your mistress, your rival, and your wife might all be steaming in the next stall. Meanwhile, in the ship's writing room, a quiet salon supposedly for correspondence, people were penning more than postcards. Stewards claimed they had to replace ink-stained blotters daily, not from writing letters, but from being used as makeshift excuses during trysts. Imagine the Edwardian version of sending risky DMs, except on monogrammed stationery. And speaking of paper trails, gossip said one society woman had her maid deliver a note that simply read, "Tonight, promenade deck after supper." No emojis, no ghosting, just pure scandal RSVP. Some historians later joked that Titanic wasn't just a ship, it was the world's largest floating Tinder experiment. Swipe starboard, darling. The crew, of course, noticed everything. Stewards whispered about wealthy men bribing them for discreet room service, not the kind involving sandwiches. One officer even admitted after the sinking that half the gossip he'd overheard could have ruined entire families back in Boston and London. Iceberg ahead? Please. The bigger danger was gossip columns waiting on shore. Second class wasn't innocent either. The piano lounge became an accidental dating hub. A teacher played Chopin while two widows lingered nearby, and suddenly people were pairing off faster than Titanic's dance cards could keep up. One pamphlet published after the tragedy sneered the Titanic was an ark of pleasure, not salvation. Savage, but catchy. And then came third class, where privacy was practically non-existent. Yet somehow, romances flourished anyway. A young couple from Galway was rumored to have staged a marriage ceremony with fellow passengers as witnesses, complete with fiddles and dancing. Titanic steerage wasn't just a journey, it was a speed dating festival. Caricatures published later showed the iceberg not as a villain, but as a jealous chaperone barging into the world's largest floating party to shut it down. One cartoon even sketched the iceberg with a monocle and a police whistle. Imagine dying in the Atlantic only to be mocked by doodles in the papers back home. Brutal. But here's the irony. Many of the richest, most scandal-prone passengers were also the ones who made it into lifeboats first. And when they returned to dry land, their reputations were wetter than their shoes. The gossip didn't sink. It sailed right into drawing rooms, salons, and tabloids, making them infamous for life. So yes, Part 2 of Titanic's story shows us that while the ship had ballrooms, orchestras, and grand dining, it also had sweat-soaked steam rooms, scribbled love notes, and romances that would have shocked even Casanova. Forget unsinkable. Titanic was unstoppable when it came to scandal, and trust me, the iceberg only froze half the story. By now, Titanic had turned into less of a ship and more of a floating masquerade. Behind all the velvet curtains and polished brass, scandals were happening faster than the ship's engines could churn. Let's start with the smoking room, a gentleman's retreat, supposedly a sanctuary of cigars and brandy. But in reality, a matchmaking hub where men compared not just poker hands, but also mistresses. One steward swore he overheard a titled lord bragging, "I bet on horses less expensive than my latest affair." Imagine Tinder bios, but with cigars and monocles. Meanwhile, the grand staircase wasn't just for photo opportunities. It became the ship's catwalk of desire. Ladies floated down in chiffon gowns, scanning the room like Instagram influencers looking for likes. Gentlemen waited below, pretending to admire the architecture while mentally bookmarking their favorites. The iceberg wasn't the only thing being sized up that week. Then there was the music. The ship's band wasn't just playing hymns and waltzes, they were setting the mood. One passenger quipped that the violins were responsible for more proposals than Cupid himself. Romantic? Sure. But when half those proposals were to people already married, the harmony was a little off-key. The Marconi wireless room deserves a scandal spotlight too. Officially, it was for important telegrams. Unofficially, it was Titanic's gossip hotline. Wealthy women sent coded messages to lovers on shore using phrases like, "the weather is fair," when they really meant, "the affair is alive." Think WhatsApp, but with Morse code and silk gloves. Of course, the stewards couldn't resist talking. In third class, whispers spread that some passengers were caught in the linen closets. Hardly five-star luxury, but apparently practical. "Better linens than lifeboats," joked a satirical cartoon after the sinking. Savage, but accurate. And then there was the gymnasium. Yes, Titanic had a full fitness suite with cycling machines and rowing contraptions. While first-class gentlemen puffed theatrically, their wives slipped away for private exercise of another kind. A London paper cruelly suggested Titanic's gym trained stamina in more than one department. By now, the scandals were stacking up faster than the ship's champagne glasses. Satirical pamphlets back on land portrayed Titanic as less a liner and more a floating Eros temple. One lampoon even sketched Captain Smith turning a blind eye, captioned, "Eyes on the horizon, not the hallway." The cruel irony? When disaster struck, many of these secret liaisons unraveled in public. Husbands discovered wives weren't where they claimed. Mistresses fought for seats in lifeboats alongside legitimate families. Gossip became survival currency. People exposed rivals' secrets in hopes of securing a space. Forget women and children first. It was more like skeletons out of the closet first. And when survivors reached New York, reporters weren't asking about the iceberg first. They were asking about affairs, notes, and midnight promenades. One tabloid headline shouted, "Lust on the liner, worse than the waves." Brutal, but it sold out by morning. Titanic's scandal isn't just about luxury. It's about hypocrisy, masks slipping faster than lifeboats lowering, and reputations drowning alongside fortunes. The Titanic promised elegance and order, but in truth, it was chaos in silk gloves. And the real iceberg wasn't in the Atlantic, it was in the gossip columns waiting on shore. By the time Titanic's survivors set foot on American soil, the ship wasn't just a wreck at the bottom of the Atlantic, it was a scandal machine in overdrive. And the newspapers? Oh, they feasted like starving wolves. Forget the heroics and the icebergs. Headlines screamed about lovers caught red-handed, mistresses discovered, and fortunes gambled away in card rooms. "Lust and luxury lost at sea" became the tabloid slogan of the season. Imagine TMZ with fountain pens and printing presses. First-class passengers who once strutted down the grand staircase like gods of Olympus now stumbled into courtrooms and salons, forced to explain who exactly they were with at midnight on April 14th. Wives raised eyebrows, lawyers sharpened quills, and gossip columnists practically needed ice baths from the heat of their stories. One tale spread like wildfire. A steel magnate who leapt into a lifeboat with his mistress, only for his wife to be spotted safe in another. New York society had a field day. Caricatures showed him rowing two boats at once, captioned, "Unsinkable infidelity." And then there was the scandal of the jewels. Several women claimed they'd lost priceless diamonds in the chaos, but rumors whispered that some weren't lost at all, just quietly gifted to secret companions before the plunge. Imagine losing the world's most famous ship and still managing to sneak in a tax-free bribe. That's efficiency. Meanwhile, back in Europe, pamphlets weren't talking about maritime safety. They were lampooning Titanic as the floating Sodom. Cartoons showed the iceberg dressed as a prudish nun, delivering God's judgment. Harsh? Yes. Effective? Absolutely. Copies sold out in hours. The survivors themselves didn't help. Some became overnight celebrities, but the wrong kind. A famous countess gave interviews dripping with innuendo about her special friends on board. The press dubbed her the Iceberg Venus. Elegant? Maybe. Discreet? Not at all. Third-class tales were no less juicy. In pubs across Ireland, stories spread of couples who met in steerage and survived together, sparking marriages that no one's parent approved. Priests wagged their fingers, newspapers wagged their headlines, and suddenly Titanic wasn't just a tragedy, it was Tinder at sea. And what about the crew? Letters from survivors revealed that some stewards sold information to reporters for cash: who was holding hands with whom, who begged for seats in lifeboats, who was last seen in the linen closets. It wasn't just maritime history being written, it was bedroom history. Even the rescue ship Carpathia wasn't immune. Rumors swirled that its cabins became makeshift confessionals, survivors spilling secrets, crying, swearing others to silence. And let's be honest, half of them kept their promises as well as Titanic kept afloat. The fallout? Lawsuits, divorces, and scandal-ridden salons from New York to Paris. Titanic had promised a voyage of grandeur. It delivered a legacy of whispers and shame. The iceberg may have sunk the ship, but gossip sank reputations faster. Titanic didn't just drown in the Atlantic, it drowned in its own secrets, one pamphlet, one headline, one scandal at a time. By now, Titanic was less a shipwreck and more a traveling circus of scandal. You'd think Europe and America would move on. After all, wars, revolutions, and depressions were just around the corner. But no. Titanic's secrets became a cottage industry. In London, salons practically installed revolving doors for gossip. Hostesses begged survivors to attend their evenings, not to share grief, but to spill sordid tales. Tell us again, darling, about the millionaire who cried when his mistress wouldn't row. Imagine Netflix series cliffhangers, but told over champagne. Paris wasn't far behind. Caricatures plastered shop windows. Titanic drawn as a great bed, its passengers tangled in sheets, the iceberg peeking like an outraged chaperone. People didn't just laugh, they bought copies, framed them, and whispered, well, at least they died fashionably. And America? Oh, it devoured scandal like popcorn. New York tabloids hired Titanic specialists whose only job was to dig up more dirt. Every week, another exposé. Secret affairs, diamond trades, cowardly men, bold women. Who needed Broadway when the streets had their own soap opera? One pamphlet, best-selling in Boston, was titled Cabins and Confessions. It claimed that Titanic's luxury suites were less about mahogany panels and more about midnight rendezvous. Was it true? Probably not. Did it sell? Absolutely. Think of it as the 50 Shades of Grey of its time, minus the safe word, plus an iceberg. Even clergy got in on the act. Priests thundered from pulpits about the floating Tower of Babel, warning that lust had brought the ship down. Of course, they discreetly ignored that half their congregation had already purchased pamphlets for bedtime reading. But perhaps the cruelest twist came from survivors themselves. Some leaned into the scandal, turning it into branding. A widow rebranded as a tragic temptress toured lecture halls, selling signed portraits with captions like, "Saved by Destiny." Was she grieving? Maybe. Was she profiting? Definitely. Others weren't so lucky. Men accused of cowardice lost business deals, fortunes, and marriages. One banker, mocked in cartoons as the coward of the Carpathia, spent the rest of his life trying, and failing, to shake the nickname. And still, Titanic scandals wouldn't die. Decades later, grandchildren of survivors were still fielding questions. So, was your grandmother really the iceberg Venus? Gossip had become a family heirloom, passed down like silver spoons and unpaid debts. It's almost poetic, really. A ship built to be unsinkable became immortal not for its engineering, but for its scandals. The steel rusted, the decks collapsed, but the whispers? They floated forever. The church, naturally, tried to drown the rumors in holy water. Pastors thundered from pulpits about decency, discipline, and divine punishment. Yet even they couldn't resist sneaking a peek at the pamphlets on the way home. It was the Regency version of watching racy TikToks at 2 a.m. Condemn it publicly, enjoy it privately. Meanwhile, Titanic survivors were caught in awkward dinner parties for decades. Imagine being 70 years old, sipping soup, when your grandson suddenly asks, "Grandma, is it true you danced with a half-naked officer while the ship was sinking?" Silence. Awkward spoon clink. Family scandal resurrected again. And the bankers, oh, the poor bankers. One especially unlucky financier was roasted mercilessly. Cartoonists portrayed him clinging to champagne bottles instead of life vests. He became a meme before memes existed. His great-grandchildren probably still avoid the topic, whispering at reunions, "Don't mention Titanic or Grandpa will leave the table." Every decade, the wreck was rediscovered, but not just underwater. On stage, in books, in whispers. It became less about icebergs and more about pillow talk. Survivors' memoirs carefully forgot certain details. Gaps in the record were filled by imagination, innuendo, and entrepreneurial pamphlet sellers. By the 1980s, when Titanic wreck footage first reached the world, the commentators couldn't resist slipping in references. "Here lies the ballroom where they danced their last waltz." And in the margins, tabloids printing, "Was it just a waltz or something more?" Even in death, Titanic couldn't escape its reputation as the most scandalous cruise in history. Because here's the irony. The Titanic was sunk by an iceberg. It was sunk again and again by gossip, by pamphlets, by rumor. Every generation refroze it into their own morality play. The church saw sin, the tabloids saw sales, and well, we just can't resist a juicy story that mixes sex, death, and the world's most famous ship. And that's the tragedy, isn't it? The Titanic drowned in the Atlantic, but its reputation drowned in scandal. Turns out the unsinkable ship wasn't the real myth. The unsinkable gossip was.